Good afternoon and welcome to this live stream hosted by the Texas Public Policy Foundation. My name is Rafael Bejar. I'm Director of Outreach for the Foundation, and I will serve as your moderator for this discussion. As it is Hispanic Heritage Month, we decided it would be a great opportunity to speak a little bit and explore about Hispanics in Texas, their past, present, and looking towards the future. And to join me in this discussion, I invited three very dear friends of mine, all very proud Latinos and very proud Texans, to have this conversation with y'all. First, we have Martinez Devada, who is an attorney, has his own law firm based in San Antonio in the little town of Army, just outside of San Antonio, of which he is a former mayor. Art is also an accomplished historian of the Tejano period, and he is going to walk us through a lot of the history that happened in the formation of Texas. And next we have really a civil rights icon in activism, Johnny Mata, based in Houston. He is part of the LULAC leadership, League of United Latin American Citizens, and also the driving force behind the Greater Houston Coalition for Justice. And last but certainly not least is my good friend Rick Figueroa, an investment expert, just opened up his own firm, Patron Partners. So congratulations, Rick, on that. And somebody who's been, is a deep man of faith and also been very involved in civic participation. And he also serves as the commissioner for the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. So welcome to all three of you and this discussion that we're going to have. So it's Hispanic Heritage Month, and for many Hispanics and non-Hispanics alike, I mean, we see this as an excuse to drink margaritas, eat tacos, and listen to Tex-Mex music. But there really is much more to Hispanic heritage than that. And Johnny, I'd like to throw you the very first question is, what does Hispanic Heritage Month mean to you, sir?
Well, it means the contributions that Hispanics have made, not only in Texas, but throughout the country. We could start the number of Medal of Honors in the military. We can talk about there's a lot of unsung heroes as well that from the ranks of the PTA, PTO, volunteerism that they've been doing for years. But we have also made a lot of landmark Supreme Court cases. And so the heritage of, particularly many of us from parents from Mexico and other areas, bring a lot of history to our communities.
Well, thank you. And certainly, Hispanics have been here for a very long time. And, Art, let's, because there seems to be a lot of confusion, again, among non-Hispanics and Hispanics alike on what is Hispanic, what is Latino, and Tejano, and Chicano, and what are all these different terms? What does that all mean? Explain it for us, brother.
Thanks, Rafa. You're absolutely right. There is a long established dialogue in the Hispanic or Latino community of what term is best used to describe it. So let's start with Tejano. Tejano is literally the Spanish word for Texan. That's what it means. And based upon the historical time frame, Tejanos are originally just inhabitants of Texas, but over time it kind of gradually evolved to mean individuals of Spanish descent or heritage who trace their families to colonial or early Texas. The term Mexican or Mexican American was used very frequently, especially after the mass influx of Anglos in the 1820s and 30s as a distinguishing ethnonym. The term Latino has its origins actually in French colonialism. So the French decided in the 1860s that they were going to invade Mexico over the pretext of outstanding foreign debt. They imposed an emperor, Maximilian or Maximiliano, onto Mexico. And part of their legal theory at the time was that the French and the Spanish were both descendants of the Romans. They both spoke Latin thousands of years ago, or 1,000 years ago, and therefore they're all Latinos. And so they coined the term Latin America and Latino to justify French intervention in the Americas. And since French was the international language of diplomacy, the term and the kind of stuck as far as Latin America and the term Latino. So in some areas, specifically traditionally in Mexico, the term Latino was not well received because of its origin. The term Hispanic evolved out of LULAC's 1930 census fight. So in the 1930 census, the U.S. Census Bureau was trying to reclassify Mexican Americans as non-white. In 1930 America, there was a lot of there were still Jim Crow laws and societal restrictions on non-white persons. And so LULAC stepped up and fought a lengthy battle against the Census Bureau to continue classifying Mexican Americans as white. And the compromise was that they would continue to be classified racially as white, but they invented this term of ethnicity of Hispanic. And that's where we get this white, Hispanic, non-white, Hispanic ethnicity versus race. It was a compromise with the Census Bureau. That fight largely came out of Texas, LULAC and American GI Forum, those organizations having a strong foothold or an origin in Texas. So we see that, at least traditionally, Texans or Tejanos tended to prefer the term Hispanic, whereas California activists prefer the term Latino in New York for those reasons. The term Chicano comes out of the 1960s and 70s civil rights movement. Chicano originally was a pejorative. Generally, Anglo farmers would kind of mock the accent of some of their workers, specifically those from southern Mexico, who would use the CH sound instead of the X, and Mexicanos, they came with the Chicanos. And again, it was one of those terms where it begins as a pejorative or a negative term and then is adopted as a term of ethnic pride and lifted up among those activists. So here we are in 2020. We've got some folks that have an affinity towards specific terms, whether it's Hispanic or Latino or Chicano or Tejano. They all mean slightly different things, but they all represent folks with the connection to Spanish America historically. And I think, Hispanic Heritage Month is kind of an opportunity for us to kind of explore all that, and everybody gets to decide which they want to be called, I guess.
Great. Well, thank you for that clarification. And I know that that tends to be a source of confusion for many folks on on the terminology. So let's stay with you a little bit. Obviously, as our resident Tejano historian, you have a couple of books under your belt. You just wrote one on Jose Francisco Ruiz, one of the great Tejano patriots, signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Texas Constitution, if I'm not mistaken. And then why don't you explain to us how and why Tejanos were so vital in the actual formation of Texas?
Certainly. A Tejano is a new thing. Obviously we've had thousands of years of indigenous Texans. The first Spaniards to chart the coast of Texas was the Pineda expedition in the early 1500s. The first Europeans to enter Texas was Cabeza de Vaca and his three other companions who came to Texas as slaves and spent several years here, and eventually wrote a diary of his journeys in America. He essentially went from Florida all the way back into southern Mexico, and described kind of the snapshot of indigenous Texas. And from that time, Spain largely ignored Texas. Texas was a frontier area. It was remote. It was not the basis of large advanced civilizations like there were in central Mexico or in Peru. And so because of that, it was largely ignored for 2 centuries until the French began establishing a claim in Louisiana and down the Texas coast, kind of alarmed the Spanish authorities, and they began focusing on Texas. And the way the Spaniards addressed that is by following a system of missions and presidios, which is a technique they learned during the Reconquista back in Spain, the 700-year war to remove the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. And so they brought a lot of those models with them to the New World. And so one of the things they would do is establish missions among the indigenous peoples to try to convert them to Christianity and Hispanicize them, make them Spanish subjects. And in order to protect those missions, they would establish presidios, which were military institutions. Ironically, one of the most severe punishments in the Spanish army was frontier service. So you got a lot of earthy people that were sent to the frontier. It was a difficult place. It was isolated. It was remote. But a lot of those presidial soldiers retired in those communities and began the original, Spanish civil communities. San Antonio, 1718, Nacogdoches, even in what's presently Western Louisiana, that was Spanish territory at the time, El Paso, those areas had the original Spanish settlements. There were also attempts to colonize the North. Canary Islanders were sent to San Antonio, for example, and even what they would have termed civilized Indians were given land grants to locate northward in the hope that they would be a civilizing influence on the native peoples here. So Texas, developed slowly initially. It was, again, as a frontier society. It developed a ranching culture, mainly just because of what was available to the people, which is kind of the foundation of our Texas cowboy culture and cattle industries. That the first ranches were the mission ranches. The first cowboys or vaqueros were the natives peoples who had entered the mission and Hispanicized and learned these skills from the Spanish friars. Texas was populated with cattle and horses on these early expeditions. They had a practice of, at every water crossing, leaving a mating pair of horses and cows and pigs, in the hope that when they returned a generation or two later, that there would be wild herds. And that's exactly what happened. We had the development of the Texas Longhorn has its origins in that practice, and the huge area of Musteños or wild horses, which developed in South Texas, had its origins there as well. So, we have this handful of settlements that evolved, primarily San Antonio, Nacogdoches, Goliad. El Paso is traditionally viewed as a part of the New Mexican development, but again, eventually becomes part of Texas. But they have a very early beginning as well. And, it's also important to understand that, that the Spanish did have a caste system, a racial caste system with the Spanish on top and degrees of racial admixture, a mixture of indigenous, African, and Spanish. There were social restrictions based upon that, and that's an early component of Texas history. We also see a lot of Spanish governmental structures that continue to the present. The Spanish ayuntamiento or town council evolved into our county government system. It was led by an alcalde, again, which comes from the Islamic experience in Spain. The original term was alcadi, which was the Sharia law judge, which presided in Islamic Spain, and it evolved into the alcalde and then eventually a county judge. So the whole idea that we have a judicial head of our county or territorial area goes all the way back to Islamic Spain through the Spanish and Mexican period. So, you know, again, I'm skipping over vast amounts of history, but we got to progress. So, in 1810, there was a dramatic change that happened throughout all of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte arose and swept through Europe, including the Iberian Peninsula. He captured most of Spain and had the king abdicate and had his son put into captivity. This was a big crisis in Spanish America as the Napoleon put his brother on the throne of Spain, Joseph Bonaparte, and he was seen as an imposter. He was French, so nobody wanted to go along with that as well. And so we have this big crisis in Spanish America and a crisis in Spanish political theory. Spain, is always viewed itself, in opposition to France. France had the idea of the divine right of kings, the Sun King, Louis, and all of that. Spain, in contrast, had political theory based upon there is no divine right of king. They had a Jesuit, a theorist, the Salamanca school, which theorized that the only divine institution was the church, which was established by Jesus Christ, and therefore the government or the monarchy could not be divine. And so we have a Spanish liberal tradition, which is very different than the Northern European liberal tradition that most of us are familiar with that influenced the American Revolution. The Spanish liberal tradition, which comes out of the Jesuit neo-scholastic model, took root in Spanish America at that time as these events were unfolding. 1810, Father Hidalgo issues his Grito de Dolores, which starts the Mexican Revolution, Mexican War of Independence. Like the American Revolution, it was very radical and revolutionary in some fronts, such as try to eliminate the casta system and the preferences of the church. In other aspects, it was very traditional and conservative. Hidalgo's revolution ultimately fails. He's captured by the governor of Texas and the captain of the Presidio at Bejar and executed. But he sends an emissary, and a man named Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, who's very important in Texas history, northward in an attempt to contact the Americans and try to have them enter the war. And so while Hidalgo's revolution is essentially stopped in Mexico, Gutierrez de Lara escapes barely across the Sabine into Louisiana, eventually makes his way to Washington, D.C., and has an audience with the president. And the U.S. had just entered the War of 1812, so they declined to enter the war, but they allowed him permission to raise an army among the American military officers in Louisiana. And here we have the origin of the Gutierrez-McGee expedition, which enters Texas, takes Texas, and enters the first Declaration of Independence in Latin America. Actually happened in San Antonio, 1813. They declared Texas free and independent in a future state in an independent Mexico. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long. The Spanish returned, famous Battle of Medina, which was the largest battle in Texas history. About 2,000 men, or 2,000 Texans took the field. 2/3 Tejanos and indigenous, 1/3 American. And the revolutionaries were routed. Spain entered San Antonio and decimated it. And a lot of the rebels went into exile and began a 10-year proxy war with the Comanche against the Spanish authorities. This period basically devastated Texas. It got to the point where the governor even recommended abandoning the whole province because of this constant depredations. And what's really important is to understand that the generation who experienced the 1813 uprising were children, but they were those who were in leadership in 1836, which and it had a great impact on them. When the Spanish army entered San Antonio, they imposed the traditional punishment of decimation, where they drew lots, and every 10th man was executed. So every day, 4 men were drawn by lot, beheaded, paraded around the plaza. The women of this community were corralled in a building and forced to cook and serve the army. They were raped and tortured. And it's noted by many authors, the children of the community had to fend for themselves for about 2 months. And so this was the generation of Seguin and Ruiz, his children were there, and so this is what they experienced. So they really understood what tyranny was about, what physical security was about, and the consequences of war and not being able to secure your liberty or your freedom.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because a lot of the early Tejano patriots were either related to each other or were friends, right? And it comes from this basic generation that you're talking about, right? And they're really the leadership that kind of galvanizes that and moves that along with the Texians that come in. So if you can focus a little bit more about that, of that generation now.
Certainly, and you're absolutely right. So there's a lot of twists and turns in what led up to that, but ultimately, you're right. There was a small group that are related by marriage and intermarriage. Of course, San Antonio was a very compared to today, a small town. About 3,000 people total, and so they're also related by the Catholic practice of being compadres or baptizing each other's children, and so. They rose up as a group and were summarily punished as a group. Their property was confiscated. Again, Ruiz, Navarro, Veramendi were sent into exile. There was an exile community near Bayou Pierre in Louisiana that existed for quite a while. Half of the group ended up joining the American Army at the Battle of New Orleans and fighting, continued to fight there. Others became traders with the Comanches. There was a general pardon eventually, about a year later, but several of the leaders, including Ruiz, were not pardoned. And those who survived, again, were dispossessed of their property. They had to live through this period of 10 years where Texas was entirely decimated, and the Comanches were being armed by the Spanish rebels. And it had a big impact on them. 1821, Mexico gets its independence fairly peacefully. The Spanish military commanders saw the writing on the wall and agreed to independence. And we see this era now of a Mexican national identity crisis. What is Mexico? Is it? And two groups kind of evolved. There was a group which eventually became the Centralists, who saw Mexico as a metropolitan model, where Mexico City and the Mexican Valley is the center of the country. It was by far the greatest in population, and the rest of the country is kind of hinterlands that have to bow to its will. And then in the provinces, you have a federalist tradition that says, every province is sovereign. It was under the Spanish Empire, and so it should be under the Republic of Mexico. Originally, the Federalists prevailed. Some provinces, such as the Central American provinces, got their independence. They opted not to join Mexico. But Texas was the only province that wasn't given its own sovereignty. It did not become a state within the Republic of Mexico. And that kind of sets the political framework for what leads up to 1836. So the rationale being that Texas lacked population. So it was attached to Coahuila, which is the state one of the states just south of Texas, with its capital today in Saltillo. Most Texans were greatly opposed to that. They wanted to have their own independent state. They wanted to be able to maintain local control. The political elites, including Ruiz and Erasmo Seguin, actually maneuvered to have Texas connected to Coahuila because they feared it being a federal territory in which the federal Congress would have control. And they felt that the state legislature at that time in Monclova would have been easier to manipulate. And it worked out. So the state lands were in the control of the state legislature. And the Tejanos then began working on immigration, which is what they saw as the solution to their population problem, their poor economy problem, their frontier security problem with particularly with the Comanche and the Apache. And so they just wanted immigrants, and they couldn't get immigrants from Mexico. So they began focusing on American immigration and European immigration began the impresario contracts, which we see how Stephen F. Austin and others begin to arrive, and they begin a political process of trying to acculturate that, develop a cotton economy, which they viewed as necessary for population increase. Of course, that brought in the practice of chattel slavery from the United States. Mexico had its own institutions of slavery, though they were somewhat different. And we began seeing this separation or conflict between the Texas Federalists and the Coahuila Centralists. Ultimately, this all comes to a head in 1835. On a national level, there's also these divisions, and President Santa Anna dismisses the very liberal or Federalist Congress, who's trying to enact reforms, dispossessing the church and the army of a lot of their special privileges. And this is seen as extremely hostile in Texas, especially among the Anglo population, which at that point constituted a majority of persons. Mexico did several surveys of Texas. The most famous one is the Mier-Tirán survey, 1826, where they became very alarmed at the number of Anglo immigrants, particularly illegal immigration. There was really very little check on the borders with the United States. And so there was an attempt to re-Mexicanize Texas. They set up a series of forts. They tried to stamp down on illegal immigration, enforce the Catholic Church as being the only authorized religion, but all that was, it all failed. By 1836, again, with the suspension of the Mexican Congress and the suspension of the Constitution, the liberal Constitution of 1824, we see the uprising, especially among the Anglo population, in Austin's colony, and we see the Tejanos, particularly those in San Antonio, join on for their own rationale. And so, there is a bit of a disconnect in the political rationale. You see the Tejano participants really steeped in this idea of Mexican federalism, of state sovereignty. The Battle of the Alamo was fought over the Constitution of 1824, which was the proposition that, to have the Constitution restored and that Texas should be an independent state within the Republic of Mexico. And it wasn't until after the massacre at the Alamo that the independence movement really took the majority of folks and took heart. You do see that a majority of the Tejano participants do not continue after independence is declared. So when you see these lists of Tejano participants, almost all of them are prior to the Declaration of Independence. So Goliad, Victoria, those kind of communities chose not to participate in independence. It was viewed as an act of treason versus an act of trying to restore a lawful constitution. The primary exception being San Antonio. So, and I think you can trace that to their direct experience in 1813. They knew what was going to happen with the rebellion. They knew that the Mexican army led by Santa Anna, who was in the army in 1813, what they could do to Texas and to San Antonio. And Ruiz actually writes an interesting letter. Ruiz signs the Declaration of Independence. He's elected as a senator in the Congress, and he writes home over that Christmas, 1836. And he advises everybody not to assist the Mexican army when they return. And he says quite explicitly, we've cast our lot with the Americans because they are freedom-loving people, and they have the arms to defend it. And that was very important for Ruiz. He participated in uprisings where they did not have the arms or the manpower to defend that liberty, and they saw what happened, and it was horrific, and it took a generation to recover from. And so, it was important that they had this tradition of I guess we would call today a Second Amendment tradition, or the arms to defend liberty. Was very important to that generation.
That's great. So, and then, and obviously we have some of the more well-known figures. You have Devada. Obviously, you spoke a little bit about Ruiz. You have Colonel Juan Seguin, who obviously helped out in a lot of the military matters. You have the very famous Texas Volunteer Company, and you have 9 Tejanos that actually died at the Battle of the Alamo. And so there are a lot of historical figures that were very prominent in this early part of Texas independence, and not only on the battlefield, but also behind the scenes on the diplomatic front and on the political front. And just to kind of speed up the history there a little bit, I mean, you have Devada actually becomes the first vice president of the state of Texas. So, you know, these are all very important unifying efforts in the very beginning. But after the revolution, or after independence and the Declaration of Independence, what happens, just briefly,
Sure.
to to these Tejano patriots that were so key in the formation of Texas? In just
Certainly.
a couple of minutes.
Yeah, well, you know, a handful of them don't survive that long. You know, Zavala dies shortly after the revolution. Ruiz dies in 1840. Unfortunately, what we see is a period of anti-Mexican sentiment that comes about following independence. We see even Seguin eventually reinvading Texas as part of the Mexican army. He always claimed that he was forced. The people saw him as a traitor. He becomes a conflicted figure. Navarro is perhaps the individual who lasts the longest in public life. You know, we see, for example, let me back up. Francisco Ruiz files a resolution in the Mexican Congress to stop the Texas Rangers and the Texas Army from harassing the Mexican Texans of the period. But again, racial hostility gets very intensified, and there's a period of what's termed by historians of racialization. So prior to independence, you know, essentially everybody's Tejano. So there's really not this, we have this Spanish view of the casta system. Are you an Espanol? Are you a mestizo? Are you an Indian? Afterwards, we have this American racialization process that occurs where folks are lumped together as just Mexican and are given second-class status. There's a great dispossession of land that occurs often through the passage of laws that are very unfamiliar to the Spanish-Mexican citizens, the imposition of property taxes. Think about it, it's 1840. How do you find out? You know, you're on your farm. They post notice at the courthouse. You don't pay your taxes, and the sheriff comes in as a tax sale. So, for example, Bexar County, in a period of 10 years, went from about 80% owned by Tejanos to 20%. And it's you have other areas, especially in South Texas, where dispossession is done by violence, by force. Laws are passed that anybody who was not loyal to the revolution is considered a traitor and loses their property, and that's unfairly adjudicated. Navarro is one of the first Mexican American civil rights leaders. He's often forgotten when we talk about the civil rights movements, but in the 1876 Constitution, after the Civil War, Navarro leads the fight on the floor of the convention to continue to classify Tejanos as white. And again, at that time, we're operating under a 19th century white versus non-white racial political structure. So being classified as non-white means a tremendous loss of liberty and rights. And he's successful doing so. And so he's viewed by many as the first in preserving Mexican American civil rights as best he could under that racial construct.
Let's bring in Johnny into this in this part of the conversation. So you know, and thank you for that historical update on you know, what happened. Now we're in the period of the teens, the 20s. You have the Mexican Revolution happening on the other side of the border. You have more waves of Hispanic immigration coming into Texas. So you have an increase, and then you also have this hardening of the position among the Texians, white Texans against Hispanics. and you see increasing accounts of discriminations, in some cases systemic discrimination. You have the massacre in the Porvenir massacre in 1915, with the Texas Rangers coming in. And then at the same time, you also have a very loyal Hispanic population in Texas, and a lot of them are veterans. I mean, you had, actually we skipped over the American Civil War, and people don't actually realize that many Tejanos were actually serving on both sides of the Civil War. You had some Hispanics in Confederate gray, and you had some Hispanics in Union blue, and you had brother fighting brother, much like the rest of America at that time. And so that's all very important. And then what I'm driving at is that patriotism, right, which is exhibited by Hispanic veterans, comes back, Johnny, and that's very important in the formation of organizations such as LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that formation and the importance that has in the civil rights movement and for Hispanics in Texas?
Well, I think it's very important. One of the things that at that period, there was a lot of discrimination against Hispanics in the criminal justice system, in the schools. And the fact is that there were separate schools for Hispanics or Mexican Americans. And so in 1929, 3 organizations formed, unified, and created the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, to fight discrimination and all the injustices that took place. In 1945, there was a major civil rights case on education. One of the very important cases came in 1954 in the Hernandez versus Texas. That's when a lot of LULAC members, there was Hernandez, the Hispanics were arguing that no Hispanics were serving in jury duty. So there was a Hispanic Hernandez being tried in the courts. And so they carried that battle all the way to the Supreme Court. What was unique on that, what they had to show is, for example, in the Supreme Court, they showed whether it was in the courthouse or elsewhere, you had to have separate drinking water fountains for Mexicans and for whites and blacks. You had to use the bathrooms were labeled separate. In the schools, the similar situations where the education was inferior for the protected class, which is known now, Mexican Americans, blacks, and others. So when the attorney Garcia was allowed 10 extra minutes in his presentation in the Supreme Court, sort of unheard of. And that is when they categorized Latinos or Mexican Americans as a separate entity. And so that went a long way. And after that, LULAC continued to fight various battles along the way that that opened the doors and improved the quality of life for Latinos. You know, their history has not really portrayed persons of colors, Latinos, having the right place in society. And even though back then we still have to fight some of the similar situations of discrimination. I did fail to recognize the American GI Farm under Dr. Garcia, a doctor out of Corpus. When he returned from the military, there was a lot of discrimination against veterans. And so there was a case, if I'm correct, in Three Rivers, where one of the veterans that was brought back, the wife expected the viewing to be in the regular funeral home, and they denied that. So therefore, through the efforts of Dr. Garcia and GI Forum, that case was very instrumental as well. And he was finally laid to rest in Washington, D.C. with honors. It's a gradual increment of rights. One of the things that Mr. Martinez alluded to, the voting, where the poll tax was another issue, that you had to pay poll tax in order to vote. And LULAC was very instrumental in overturning that situation. So it's been a long battle, a long struggle to get where we are today.
Yeah, no, thank you, Johnny, and you have certainly been on the forefront of that battle, and that battle does continue on today. And Rick, I want to bring you now into the conversation. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of history that we've gone through, and we really just scratched the surface of that history. We're talking about 300 years of history. Moving forward, but let's talk about the present and now moving into the future. I mean, despite all the ups and downs and discrimination, Hispanics in Texas are very proud of being Texan, of being American. They're very proud of their own cultural heritage, and they put that on the front line. Literally, you have 15 Hispanic Congressional Medal of Honors winners here in Texas. Some just giant heroes, but a lot of those heroes are not only the ones that serve in uniform, and there are many, but they're just regular folks. Trying to live their lives and live the American dream. Being an American, being Texan, and also being Hispanic. Having all those come together. And let's talk about the present. Let's and move it into the future. So we have a Hispanic population of about 40%, right? It's about, depending on the census numbers that you're looking at, close to 11, maybe 12 million Hispanics in Texas. And that's about 40%, 39-40% of the population in Texas. 70% are U.S. born, right? So the majority of them are born here in the state. You only have about 30% that are foreign born. And of all the Hispanics, as was mentioned before, the majority are of Mexican origin, right? 87% are Mexican origin, only 13% are Hispanic, not of Mexican origin. And let me just break down through some of the other stats, and then you can, comment on them. The median age is about 28, so you're talking about a younger population. So that is something that is going to bode well for future growth. And that the annual median personal income is about $22,000. That ranks about 19th in the U.S. And there's about 34% poverty rate among Hispanics in Texas. And home ownership is about 55% of Hispanic home ownership in the state of Texas. And that's actually ranking number 4 in the state, in the country, I mean. And as far as education goes, I mean, Texas is, if not the second, is the second largest Hispanic student population in the state. There's so many Hispanic students in the system that's 48%, and that's the number 2 ranking in the state. So, those are some of the stats that kind of bring us up to date, give us a very quick, rough snapshot. But I want to bring you in. You're the investment guy. You see what's happening. And you're also, you're a boy from the barrio. You were there, in the barrio growing up, and you had your own personal struggles to get to where you were, and, trying to move forward. How do you see the historic effort of Latinos just, living their lives and growing the Texas economy, creating their own wealth, handing it over to their children, and having trying to generate that prosperity? How does that look?
Well, thanks, Rafa. First of all, thank you for allowing me to jump in here and be a part of this. And Johnny, it's great to see you and the work you've done in art. I'll never challenge you in Jeopardy again in my life. I'll tell you that right now. God love you. Never bet you on that one. I think, in my sense, on a economic point of view, right? We did Tomas Rivera had a study, UCLA, and it studied minority wealth, and it found out the smallest minority among the American community was the most wealthiest, and it was the Jewish community. And after it did that, it looked at the attributes that were associated with why this community was one of the most wealthiest and also politically powerful communities in the United States. And it came up with 4 attributes. One is it was legacy minded. The community was driven by establishing the generation behind it to be better than it's currently sitting, and that was huge. 2, it was educational minded, which I think is pretty random. I mean, it's pretty common. But the third one I thought was interesting is it had a moral compass. There was a truth outside of among others, and they played by certain rules. And I think that as the communities develop, right, Hispanic communities is in the embryonic stages here in Texas. We're starting to really feel our own oats, and size doesn't really matter unless you make impact. And that's what that study basically said, because the smallest minority community made the most impact politically and economically. And so in my business, we see only one color, that's green. And so you study the behaviors of people of means, and you figure out how does that community, and I think our community needs to be more aware of establishing at least a high priority on education, and making sure to establish and not forget our moral codes that got us. I give speeches and I say, my mother gave me 7 lessons, and they weren't complicated when I grew up. I grew up without a dad, and they said, lesson number 1 is get your butt out of bed and go to work. Lesson number 2 is you don't expect anybody to help you. Lesson number 3 is you help others when you can. Lesson number 4 is you work hard every day and you find a good woman and you marry her. Lesson number 5 is you raise godly kids, right? Lesson number 6 is you pray every day. That's important. And the 7th lesson, which I think covers it all, is you honor God in everything you do. And I think the simplicity of that is we have to echo that in our current and our future if we're going to be of any significance. Time and time again, numbers don't matter. There have been large groups of ethnic groups have been taken advantage of because they haven't focused on those values. And so those are important. And I think the cultural shift right now, we have an opportunity because people have treated the Hispanic community as a monolithic group. And that's not going to be the case. I mean, if you've seen art distributed, there's all kinds of Hispanics. And so I think we have to understand and dissect our DNA. And then from there, develop what kind of minority community we want to be individually, whether it's Mexicanos or whether it's Cubans or Puerto Ricans or South Americans, Central Americans, but own that narrative and then we establish some sort of ownership and steward that to a greater cause and learn from other communities that have done well. And that's so critical. So that's cool, kind of what I see. I mean, the metric of money isn't the only metric that, determines the success of a community. I think the measure of a community can be money, it can be education, but it also can be how it's impacted the world. And, this great American experiment, called the United States of America, right? This big experiment started off in a very small group in colonies, but I think it's our turn as Hispanics to contribute to that DNA fabric of America and to establish our fingerprints on it. Now, whether it's good or bad, that's up to us. And I think we have to own that responsibility.
Yeah, and speaking of responsibility, I mean, I think that it's extremely important that, is participation, right? It's participation in our communities, civic participation. And it's like the old saying, that, if you don't participate in voting and you don't participate in government, you really don't have a leg to complain about it, right? And I think that that's something that we're seeing an increase, or we should see an increase in our communities across the state of Texas and Hispanic communities is have more of a willingness to engage in the system in order to better that system, because without that, without that important Hispanic voice, without that participation, and then it's just not going to happen. How do you see, just, final question for you is, what are some of the growth areas that you see for Hispanic opportunity coming into the future?
Well, politics is one. You mentioned it real simply, is we are apathetic towards politics. When I go to political functions, I've played in the federal arena and the state arena. I'm hard pressed to find other Hispanics because it takes time and money and sacrifice, and you don't get the ROI immediately. And so they're disinterested in it, which is indicative of most culture. But it's a chess move for Hispanics to be involved in politics, because you can't walk into a room and expect people just to embrace you. It takes consistency, time, and effort. And you have to, you might not be the generation they embrace, but the people behind you might be, and you got to be comfortable with that. So I think politics and apathetic towards politics, and the establishment of not just participating, but being focused in getting the values that we love and care for, and holding these politicians accountable. Politicians are reactionary creatures, and people don't understand that. They're reactionary creatures. They're not proactive. They react to the constituents, and those are important, and we push and press into that. And most people make the worst mistake possible with politics, is they make this assumption, confusing common sense with politics. It's never going to be the case. It is a constant strategy of pressing into individuals who are able to determine your future, whether you like it or not. And at every level, whether it's MUD district or the President of the United States, these people, whether you like it or not, have impact on your life. And you can ignore it, you can dismiss it, you can be apathetic towards it, but make no mistake about it, they're going to impact you. The impact is not a position of whether you care, you allow it to happen or not. It's going to happen. And so that kind of passion is absent in a lot of places. And so you drag people, you push people, you beg people. And then when they do get in there, their time is short pressed, or they don't really stay the course, and they want immediate results. And so that's the second part. But this is most important. Growing up, I grew up without a dad, and I used to say, that I never missed what I never had. And that used to get me by. But now being a dad, a father of 4 kids, God's blessed me with that. I will tell you that's a wrong statement. I did. I mean, I didn't have somebody teach me how to throw a baseball or football or teach me how to fix a lawnmower or do things. And you get by, and I've been blessed. But the core competency of having a family, in having a parent and a mom in a house vested in the future of a child is priceless. Schools are not meant to raise kids. Prisons are not meant to raise kids. All right. We have to go back and we have to press into our culture the importance of a family, and knowing that families are our cornerstone. That's where things begin. We cannot allow institutions to take the ownership role of a father or a mother. And so I think that's important. If our future community is to thrive, if it's to do well, it will not. And I will tell you, from an economic point of view, from a political point of view, from any point of view, will not succeed if we don't have a family that's vested in the kids. Because institutions are, at best, a Band-Aid, at best. But at worst, they're crippling. And that is so imperative that people understand that. And so, we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month for 30 days, and every year we get our little turn, African American Month, whatever our turn is. I like it. It rings the bell, and I appreciate, Rafa, you doing this, but make no mistake about it, right? This is not a 30-day awareness. This is a 365-day awareness. And if we don't do this, if we don't ring our own bell, forget trying to change politics, Washington, Austin, whatever. We have to change our own community. I think we're doomed. And so that's the bell that I want to ring. I mean, we went through history, and we saw the history of back and forth of where we've lost and been on the wrong side of history. But to be on the right side of history, we have to invest in our families, the values, and we have to be willing to play chess and not checkers in this game called life in regards to our community. And that's why I'm here today with you right now. That's important.
Thank you. And you really just took the words out of my mouth. For me, when I think about Hispanic Heritage Month, it's not a 30-day proposition, that's for sure. It's a 365 proposition. And what I think about is I think about family, and not only my family, but all those that went behind, us, and then also kind of looking to the future. We only have a couple of more minutes, and let's see if we have any questions from the audience. One of the questions, and I guess we're going to direct it to Art, is that the listener expresses a lot of appreciation for the historical background, and is asking, what's a good book to read for more information on the topic? So Art, you may have a suggestion or two.
Certainly. Well, let me plug my book first. I have a new book out called Tejano Patriot, The Revolutionary Life of Jose Francisco Ruiz. And it chronicles the area through the eyes of Francisco Ruiz. He was born in 1783, dies in 1840, goes through this whole period of Mexican Revolution, Texas independence, and his rise up through leadership in the community, and his years in exile among the Comanches. So that's a very interesting book. There's several others on the area. Dr. Frank de la Terra has a series of books about San Antonio and early Texas. So I would look at any of those kind of books. But unfortunately, it's kind of it's a newer area of history. It's one that's probably only in the last 20 years have been extensively written on, and it's a great field to be in these days because there's so much coming out and so much new research coming forward, and so it's an exciting area.
All right. So, and then, and this may be the last question, and somebody submitted a question on what is something that non-Hispanics can do to help build unity. I think, Johnny, I'll throw this out to you. And I mean, we're all Texans, right? I mean, obviously, we have, we're talking about Hispanic Heritage Month and us being Hispanics, but at the end of the day, we're all Texans. What can we do?
Give me the question again, please.
Yeah, what is something that non-Hispanics can do to help build unity?
There's many things. For example, we need volunteers. It doesn't matter what color, nationality you are. There's volunteers to tutor students, especially in now that a lot of schools are going viral because of the epidemic. The parents and the student need help with their laptops to be able to connect. And so there are organizations that are, many of the good organizations are in the internet, and you can more or less, we have like the LULAC Educational Service Center. We provide scholarships to get students in college. So all of these are in the internet, and whatever you would like to do, look in the internet to see what are organizations that interest you, and get yourself and others to support the service that we're rendering. In many cases, some of these are even tax exempt. In other words, you can write it off. But that's how you build the community.
Great. Well, I think that we're just about out of time. I'd like to thank you all for joining me, our Martinez Devada, Johnny Mata, and Rick Figueroa. This has certainly been an enlightening conversation. It's, with 300 years of history, it's hard to do it justice. I mean, I feel that we just, scratched the surface, and there's a lot of, unsung heroes that we weren't really able to get to. And this is just the beginning of that, the conversation. And again, on the heroes that were on the political front, on the military front, who served in uniform, who are civil rights leaders, who are business leaders, entertainers, a whole host, and they all make up the DNA of Texas, because it's part of our blood. And as we're moving forward for continuing the Hispanic Heritage Month, I ask you all just to to think about those, and that quite honestly, in my mind, you can't have Texas without Hispanics in it. So thank you all very much for joining us. Rafael Bejar with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you.